Good evening. 5 days ago, over in the state of North Carolina, a white male marketing executive who claimed that he was fired from his job because his employer wanted to diversify the workforce, well, he just won a $10 million discrimination lawsuit. Meanwhile, over in Texas, Governor Greg Abbott has just signed a new bill into law which bars student athletes from playing on any other sports teams that do not match the gender that's listed on their birth certificates. And then likewise, also in the state of Texas, a federal judge has just ruled that doctors cannot be compelled to perform either transgender surgeries or abortions if it goes against their religious beliefs. And then lastly, it was just revealed that George Soros is now funding anti-disinformation media companies in order to, what they call, restore social trust. Let's go through it all together. This is your daily Facts Matter update, and I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. And now let's begin today's discussion by talking a bit about George Soros, specifically about the fact that both him as well as another billionaire named Reid Hoffman are now founding anti-disinformation media companies in order to, what they call, restore social trust. Now, to be more specific, Mr. George Soros, as well as Mr. Hoffman, they are funding a new venture called Good Information Incorporated. And then Good Information Inc., they will use the money to fund new media companies in order to, and this is a quote from their press release, quote, restore social trust and strengthen democracy by investing in solutions that counter disinformation and increase the flow of good information online. Now, this George Soros-funded company, Good Information, it was founded by a woman named Ms. Tara McGowan, who previously ran a progressive nonprofit called Acronym. And if that sounds familiar to you, well, it might be because, as reported in the magazine Fast Company, Acronym ran one of the biggest digital marketing campaigns amounting to about $100 million worth, aimed at convincing millions of Americans to vote against Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And then furthermore, that same company, Acronym, under the leadership of Ms. Tara McGowan, it invested in another company called Shadow. And Shadow, that might also sound familiar to you because that was the firm that produced those vote tabulation apps that were used in the Iowa caucuses last year, which, if you remember, the reporting for that was delayed by about 2 weeks and it had many, many technical issues. Regardless, Ms. Tara McGowan is now in charge of her new venture, Good Information, which is being funded partly by George Soros, and that will be investing that money into media outlets that provide people with trusted and fact-based information. That was what Ms. Tara McGowan said. And on a side note, maybe I will send in my application for our program Facts Matter, and maybe we can get some of that sweet, sweet George Soros funding as well. You never know. Regardless, if you'd like to read more about this new company, I'll throw a link to it into the description box below this video for you to check out. However, while we are on the topic of George Soros, let's briefly talk about the Virginia elections. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Glenn Youngkin, who is the Republican candidate for governor, he was publicly discussing some of the chaos that is playing itself out in Virginia's school system, particularly with parents who are standing up to school boards and pushing back against critical race theory being taught in the classrooms. And during that speech, Mr. Youngkin said that the blame for this problem is laid squarely at the feet of his opponent. But he also added this.
The blame for these wrongs and the present chaos in our schools lays squarely at the feet of 40-year politician Terry McAuliffe, but also at George Soros-backed allies. These allies that are in the left, liberal, progressive movement, they've inserted political operatives into our school system disguised as school boards.
And now, if you have been following politics for a while now, you know that what Mr. Youngkin did right there is touch the third rail of public discourse. He mentioned the name George Soros. And so, after he made that statement, a congresswoman by the name of Elaine Luria, who currently holds the 2nd District in Virginia's House of Representatives, she came out and she claimed that just by bringing up George Soros' name, Mr. Glenn Youngkin was being anti-Semitic. Here's what she said. Call it out in my own party, and I'm calling it out now. Evoking George Soros as a shadowy funder is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. This is an unacceptable statement from Glenn Youngkin. However, and this is the interesting part, if you dig through some of the campaign finance records that are available in the public record, you will find that Ms. Elaine Luria herself has received tens of thousands of dollars from PACs that are linked to George Soros. And in terms of what that funding actually looked like, well, here's what Mr. Glenn Youngkin's communication director wrote on Twitter. George Soros himself gave $5,000 to PAC to the Future, which later gave $5,000 to Luria's campaign. For her 2018 campaign, Luria received tens of thousands of dollars from the Swing Left PAC after Soros donated $50,000 to the organization. Now here, I would like to mention something more broadly about this topic. There is a weird trend right now in today's public discourse that as soon as you mention the name George Soros, then you are automatically either placed into the realm of conspiracy theories and/or you're called anti-Semitic, which frankly is pretty weird. Why is it weird? Well, I remember when I came to work in October of 2017 and I picked up that day's copy of the Wall Street Journal, and right there on the very front page, it said that George Soros had transferred the bulk of his wealth into the Open Society foundations. He transferred $18 billion into his foundation. It was right there in black and white, unambiguous, right there on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. $18 billion. And afterwards, I looked at that and I thought, wow, there's going to be a lot of news about this. And yet, that wasn't really the case. Not too many people talked about it, in fact. And think about that for a moment. George Soros made perhaps one of the biggest transfers to a foundation in American history, and yet, besides that article in the Wall Street Journal, I did not see too many corporate media outlets talking about it. And furthermore, very soon, it became very obvious that people were not even allowed to talk about it. That's because soon after that article was published, there was this incredibly awkward interview with Newt Gingrich when he was over on Fox News.
The number one problem in almost all these cities is George Soros elected left-wing, anti-police, pro-criminal district attorneys who refuse to keep people locked up. Just yesterday, they put somebody back on the street who's wanted for 2 different murders in New York City. You cannot solve this problem, and both Harris and Biden have talked very proudly about what they call progressive district attorneys. Progressive district attorneys are anti-police, pro-criminal, and overwhelmingly elected with George Soros' money, and they're a major cause of the violence we're seeing because they keep putting the violent criminals back on the street.
I'm not sure we need to bring George Soros into this.
I was going to say you get the last word, Speaker.
He paid for it. I mean, why can't we discuss the fact that millions of dollars he spent?
I agree with Melissa. George Soros doesn't need to be a part of this conversation.
Okay. So it's verboten.
All right, we're going to. Okay, we're going to move on.
And right there, when I saw that interview, I knew that I saw something very interesting. Because at that very moment, at least to me, it revealed a small truth about the social and political landscape. What happened on Fox News gave a tiny, tiny insight into truly who holds power in our society. In fact, it reminded me of this quote from Voltaire. If you want to know who controls you, look at who you are not allowed to criticize. That's a fascinating quote, isn't it? If you want to know who controls you, look at who you are not allowed to criticize. I mean, just mentioning it sounds conspiratorial, and yet right there on that interview with Fox News, the person you are not allowed to criticize. One of the wealthiest people in the world who donated at least $18 billion of his money to the Open Society foundations, who was funding all these campaigns of all these district attorneys across the country, and you were not even allowed to say his name. Then, a little bit closer, just about a month ago, a very similar episode happened when Larry Elder was running for office over in California, and he gave an interview to the LA Times, and here was one of the exchanges.
I'm also going to be talking about a crime. We have a couple of DAs in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and in Los Angeles, George Soros appointed DAs. The DA in LA was appointed, by the way, as DA in San Francisco by my opponent, by Gavin Newsom. They're both soft on crime. They both believe in cashless bail. And I'm going to urge the recall of those 2 DAs.
You used the phrase George Soros appointed DAs.
I think I said supported, but if I said appointed, I made a mistake. He funded them. I don't know exactly who paid what, but my impression is without George Soros's money, probably neither one of them would have been elected.
I have a couple of questions for you, but I want to start with this one. I want to ask about your decision to name drop Sidney Blumenthal and George Soros. Regardless of your feelings about either, the names of both Jewish men have repeatedly been used by the right, the alt-right in particular, as anti-Semitic dog whistles.
For crying out loud. You know, your newspaper endorsed Gavin Newsom. Your newspaper also believes that the recall election is a waste of time. So let's start with that premise. It is a fact that George Soros has funded these 2 DAs. Whether he's a Jew, a Muslim, a Satanist is irrelevant. Those are facts. and that you would suggest or imply that somehow I'm being anti-Semitic when I have been a friend of Jews, a friend of Israel, is absolutely outrageous.
Again, the very mere mention of that name, George Soros, and right away, you touch an open nerve in the acceptable public discourse. It is the taboo subject, you can say. He is the one that you are not allowed to criticize, even though, once again, his donations are a matter of public record. Regardless, though, I personally will keep digging into the story, and I will report to you whatever it is that I find. And until then, if you would like to read more about some of the research that I've been putting together, including about what happened over in Virginia, as well as this new media venture, all that will be in the description box below this video for you to check out. And all I ask in return is that you take a quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And now, before we move on over and discuss how over in North Carolina, a marketing executive who was allegedly fired for being a straight white man, just received a $10 million settlement, I would like to take a quick moment and introduce our sponsor for today's episode, and I will do so from the sound booth. That's right, Roman. The sponsor of today's episode is an awesome company called AMAC. That's AMAC, and it stands for the Association of Mature American Citizens. Now, what I learned earlier today, though, is that you don't actually need to be a mature American citizen yourself in order to join AMAC, because even though they're an organization that's geared towards people who are 50 years of age and above, you can actually join at any age as long as you're a American-loving patriot. And so what they say is that as our fundamental freedoms here in this country are being threatened by politicians who don't even necessarily know how to balance their own checking accounts, and as there is a concerted effort to censor conservatives by this woke ideology, one thing that you can do to fight back is to join the 2 million people who are already members of AMAC. And by joining, you'll have access to 3 main benefits. The first benefit is the money-saving benefit, because by joining, you'll have access to discounts on things like vitamins, restaurants, retail shops throughout the entire country. Second of all, you will gain access to the AMAC website, the AMAC app, as well as the AMAC magazine, which gives you something that the mainstream media doesn't, which is honest news that is grounded in facts. And third of all, and this is what a lot of people say is their favorite benefit, is that AMAC has your back over on Capitol Hill. Because with 2 million freedom-loving members, they are a voice for conservatives that cannot be ignored. And so if you are a person who considers themselves a constitutional conservative, then I would consider joining AMAC. You can do so over at amac.us. That's amac.us. So consider signing up, consider helping AMAC's effort, and getting access to these excellent membership benefits. So AMAC, thank you so much for sponsoring this episode. Now, Roman in the studio, back to you. And now let's move on over and talk about discrimination in the workplace. 5 days ago, a hospital's marketing executive who claimed that he was fired because he was white and then replaced by 2 women, he won a $10 million discrimination lawsuit. Now, to give you a bit of background on this particular case, as you likely already know, companies throughout America are implementing what they call diversity and inclusion programs, D&Is. And the term diversity in these programs, it typically refers to anyone who is not white, male, and or straight. Now, one such company is a large health service over in the state of North Carolina called Novant Health. And several years ago, they implemented what they refer to as a 5-year plan to boost diversity. And apparently, they were fairly serious about that goal. How serious? Well, there is the case of Mr. David Duvall, who was not only the hospital's senior vice president for marketing and communications, but also he was a straight white male. And just a few days before his 5-year anniversary at the company, back in 2018, he says that he was inexplicably fired, his position was split into 2, and both of the new roles were filled by women. A white woman was promoted to be the senior vice president of communications, and then a black woman was given the role of senior vice president of marketing. Now, because of this development, Mr. Duvall filed a lawsuit against the hospital, alleging that, for one, even though both of these women were qualified, they were no more qualified than he was, that he regularly received positive reviews for his job performance over the past 4.5 years, and that lastly, he was only fired so that the hospital can meet their 5-year plan to boost diversity. In fact, according to the lawsuit that he filed, when he was fired, his boss, quote, notified Mr. Duvall of this decision and offered no explanation for it, stating the decision had nothing to do with his performance, that he had done everything asked of him and more. And yet he was still fired, which he alleges was a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Here's specifically what his lawsuit states. Novant Health termination of Mr. Duvall for the purpose of improving diversity constituted discrimination based on sex and race. Furthermore, this lawsuit alleges that he was not the only person affected by this. Instead, he said, quote, the chief legal officer, the medical group president, the chief information officer, the patient experience officer, and the president of the Haymarket Medical Center were all replaced either by a black person or a woman in the 12 to 18 months after him. Now, the hospital in this case, it fought back and they made the argument that Mr. Duvall was actually fired for other reasons, such as his deficient performance. However, the jury did not buy that argument, and instead, they found that Mr. Duvall was in fact fired due to his sex and race, and they awarded him with a $10 million settlement. Here was a statement from Mr. Duvall's lawyer after this verdict was read. "We are pleased that the jury agreed that Duvall's race and gender were unlawful factors in his termination, that he was fired to make room for more diverse leaders at Novant." Ironically, though, the lawyer continued by saying that while he worked there, Mr. Duvall was committed to diversity and inclusion, sat on a system committee to promote it, and his team created marketing materials. The case is about the fact that you cannot fire people just to create opportunities to fill positions. It is not a case against diversity and inclusion. Mr. Duvall believes that the punitive damage award is a message that an employer cannot terminate and replace employees in order to achieve greater diversity in the workforce. And a $10 million payout is indeed a strong message that the jury sent to the company. Now, the executives over at Novant, they did not take this decision too well, saying that they will appeal at the appellate level. Here's a statement from the company. "We are extremely disappointed with the verdict as we believe it is not supported by the evidence presented at trial, which includes our reason for Mr. Duvall's termination. We will pursue all legal options, including appeal, over the next several weeks and months. It's important for all current and future team members to know that this verdict will not change Novant Health's steadfast commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity for all." If you'd like to read more about this particular case, I will throw the link to an article about it, as well as the PDF of this lawsuit. It'll all be down there in the description box below. And all I ask in return is that if you haven't already, take a quick moment to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And now let's move on over to Texas. Back in the year 2016, the University Interscholastic League, which is an organization which administers almost all of the athletic school programs in the state of Texas, they made a rule. And according to that rule, which by the way passed with widespread support, it required students to compete on teams which were in line with their own biological sex as stated on their birth certificates. And so in Texas for the past 5 years, this was an administrative rule that was put in place by this particular organization. However, as of 1 week ago, this rule has officially been codified into Texas law. That's right. Last Monday, Governor Greg Abbott, he signed a new bill into law which bars student athletes from playing on any sports teams that do not match the sex listed on their birth certificates. Specifically, this bill, which is officially called Texas House Bill 25, bars most school teams from letting students compete in competitions, quote, designated for the biological sex opposite to the student's biological sex as correctly stated on their official birth certificate. Now, the authors of this bill said that its aim was to restore the rights granted to women under Title IX, which they say were actually eroded when biological boys were allowed to compete against biological girls. For instance, on the Texas House floor, here's how Ms. Valerie Swanson, who is a Texas congresswoman and also one of the authors of this bill, here's how she describes the intention. The bill protects girls' safety and their right to equal access to athletic opportunities. Now, on the flip side, however, critics of this bill say that it discriminates against transgender students. For instance, Amit Parley, who is the director of the Trevor Project, they said this in a statement regarding the new law. Transgender and non-binary youth are already at higher risk for poor mental health and suicide because of bullying, discrimination, and rejection. This misguided legislation will only make matters worse. Regardless of the criticism, however, the bill passed by a majority in both the Texas House as well as the Texas Senate and then signed into law by Governor Abbott, who was quoted as saying this: "The State House passed legislation to protect the integrity of Texas high school sports." Now, one thing that is still unclear and that the bill doesn't specifically address is that some states, such as the state of New York where we filmed this program, now allow a third option on birth certificates. So for instance, if you have a baby in the state of New York, on the birth certificate, you can mark it as either male, female, or simply as X. And so it's not exactly clear how an athlete with one of these X birth certificates will be treated if they move to Texas and play sports. And I guess what we'll see is that in about 10 or 15 years, there will inevitably be some kind of a lawsuit that will play out on this front. Regardless, if you'd like to read more about this new Texas law, I'll throw that into the description box below this video for you to check out. However, since we're discussing transgender issues over in Texas, let's talk about something else as well. A federal judge in Texas has just ruled that the Biden administration cannot force doctors to perform sex transition surgeries, cannot force doctors to perform abortions, and cannot force health insurance companies to provide coverage for such surgeries. Here's what the judge in the case wrote specifically in his order. The court agrees and concludes that enforcement of the Biden administration's interpretation forces Christian plaintiffs to face civil penalties or to perform gender transition procedures and abortions contrary to their religious beliefs, a quintessential irreparable injury. Now, to give you a little background on this particular case, back in May of this year, Mr. Javier Becerra, who is the Biden administration Secretary of Health and Human Services, he issued a memo which directed the federal government to interpret and enforce the Affordable Care Act in a very specific way. Here's what was written in that memo. The Department of Health and Human Services will interpret and enforce Section 1557's prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sex to include, for one, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and secondly, on discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And then in practice, what that interpretation actually meant is that it made it a form of discrimination if a doctor refused to perform either a transgender surgery or an abortion, regardless of whether or not they had a religious objection in the matter. And so, a religious hospital, an association of over 20,000 healthcare professionals, as well as 9 different states, they got together and they filed a lawsuit against the Biden administration. And as we read just a moment ago, the judge in the case ruled in their favor, saying that forcing doctors to do such a thing was in fact a violation of their rights. Here's another part from that judge's ruling. When the Religious Freedom Restoration Act violation is clear and the threat of irreparable harm is present, a permanent injunction exempting Christian plaintiffs from that religion-burdening conduct is the appropriate relief. The judge then ordered for the defendants in the case, meaning the Biden administration, to permanently stop forcing doctors to perform either transgender surgeries or abortions. Now, the plaintiffs in the case were, naturally enough, thrilled with the court's decision. Here's in fact a statement from the plaintiff's lawyer. Today's ruling is a victory for compassion, conscience, and common sense. No doctor should be forced to perform controversial, medically unsupported procedures that are contrary to their conscience and could be deeply harmful to their patients. Now, we here at the Epoch Times, we did reach out to the Department of Health and Human Services for comment, but we have yet to hear back. Regardless, if you'd like to read more about this particular case, I will throw the links to it into the description box below, which is again right below that like button that I hope that you have already smashed. And if you haven't, please take a moment to. Now, lastly, now that you've completed this episode of Facts Matter, I would highly recommend that you go on over to Epoch TV and check out a phenomenal episode of American Thought Leaders where Jan sat down with the author of San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities, and they discussed the root cause of America's homelessness epidemic and why the term homeless is misleading. Here's a trailer for that awesome episode.
We see people in San Francisco with open wounds, open sores. They're dying of drug overdoses. The popular idea that we should just simply help people to remain heavily addicted, but in a slightly safer way, I find it just offensive and quite cynical. Many people need the intervention.
Today I sit down with Michael Schellenberger, author of the books San Francisco and Apocalypse Never.
We're literally paying people in the form of cash welfare, housing, and other services to live in tents, on the street, use hard drugs, defecate publicly, and commit crimes.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek.
If you want to check out that awesome episode, as well as all the other great content over on Epoch TV, I'll throw a link to it. It'll be right there at the very top of the description box. I hope you click on it. I hope you check it out. I hope you subscribe. And I hope that you join us on this journey of exploring this beautiful, beautiful world through honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. Now, lastly, if you haven't already, smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't already in order to get this type of honest news content delivered directly into your YouTube feed while YouTube still allows it. Also, consider hitting that notification bell so you can actually be notified of any new videos as we release them. And lastly, if you have an Instagram account, consider following me at Epoch Times Roman. I publish behind-the-scenes research as well as spicy memes. And then, until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed and stay free.